Have you ever really thought about what makes something matter? Like truly matter in and of itself?
Hmm. That's a question that's had philosophers scratching their heads for centuries, right?
Yeah, and it's something I think a lot of our listeners, with their interest in philosophy and ethics probably think about too. So today we're going deep on this whole idea of moral status.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
And I think it gets to the heart of so many ethical issues. Like, why do we feel we owe certain things to some beings and not others? What's the basis for that?
Exactly. We're going beyond just the legal stuff or social norms here. We're talking about something deeper, more fundamental.
We're talking about inherent moral worth.
Right. And to guide us through this, we've got our trusty Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, as always.
Always a good place to start. A solid, peer-reviewed resource.
It is. So no opinions here, just trying to lay out the established philosophical thinking on this.
Exactly. And to make it clear and understandable.
That's the goal. So let's start with the basics. What is moral status, really?
So, at its core, something has moral status if it matters morally for its own sake.
Okay, for its own sake, meaning...
Meaning there are moral reasons to treat it in certain ways that stem from its very nature, not just because of how it affects other things.
Right, so it's not just about consequences, but about something inherent in that being.
Exactly.
Could you give an example to make that clearer?
Sure. Let's say you see a cat in pain.
Okay.
If you think it's wrong to cause that suffering, not just because it might upset the owner or whatever,
Right.
but because the cat itself is experiencing something bad,
Right, because it's suffering.
then you're acknowledging the cat has some moral status. The reason to avoid that pain is for the cat's own sake.
I see, that makes sense. So how have philosophers approached this whole question of what gives something moral status?
Well, there are two main camps, broadly speaking.
Right.
The utilitarians and the non-utilitarians.
Okay, let's start with the utilitarians. What's their take?
So for utilitarians, it's all about maximizing overall well-being. They call it utility.
Utility meaning?
Happiness, basically. Pleasure in the absence of pain. And they believe everyone's happiness counts equally.
So everyone's happiness goes into the equation.
Right. And for something to be morally considerable, as they put it, its capacity to feel pleasure and pain has to be factored in.
Okay, so you have to consider the well-being of everything that can feel.
Exactly. The intensity, the duration, it all gets weighed.
Interesting. So it's like a big moral calculation?
In a way, yes. And utilitarians, while they might talk about duties, their core idea is about the overall outcome, the greatest good for the greatest number.
I see. So what about the non-utilitarians? How do they differ?
Well, for them, moral status means there are reasons to act in certain ways for the sake of that being, regardless of the overall consequences.
Okay, so it's not just about the end result, but about how you treat that being in itself.
Exactly. These reasons might include things like promoting its well-being, respecting its autonomy.
Okay, yeah.
And they see these as fundamental. They can even trump considerations of overall utility.
So it's like you owe something directly to that being, not just to the overall good.
Right, and to violate those duties is to wrong that being.
Interesting. And you mentioned this idea of full moral status. What's that about?
So some non-utilitarians believe that moral status isn't all or nothing. It can come in degrees.
Degrees.
Yeah. And full moral status, or FMS, is like the highest level. It's often associated with what we call moral persons.
Okay, so what makes something have this full moral status?
Well, there are a few key things. The first is this very strong presumption against interfering with them in certain fundamental ways.
Interfering. How so?
Things like killing them, experimenting on them without consent, inflicting suffering.
Okay, big stuff.
Right. This presumption carries a lot of moral weight.
So it's like a really high bar to clear if you want to justify doing any of that.
Absolutely. You'd need extremely strong reasons. Like maybe if their existence threatened the lives of a huge number of other beings with FMS.
Okay, so there are exceptions, but they're very, very limited.
Yes, very limited. And even then, there's usually a moral residue, like a sense of regret that such a thing was necessary.
I see. So even if it's justified, it's still not a light thing.
Not at all. And this presumption against interference for those with FMS is considered stronger than for those with lesser moral status.
Okay, that makes sense. So what else goes along with full moral status?
Well, besides this strong presumption against interference, some philosophers also include a strong reason to aid beings with FMS.
To help them.
Yes, exactly. So if someone with FMS is in need, we have a moral reason to provide assistance.
I see. But this reason to aid, is it as strong as the presumption against interference?
Not necessarily. The circumstances where it can be overridden are a bit broader.
Okay, so there's more room for judgment there.
Right. But even so, the reason to aid those with FMS is generally considered stronger than the reason to aid those with lesser status, all of the things being equal.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy there.
In a way, yes. And the third element, often associated with FMS, is a strong reason to treat fairly.
To treat them fairly, meaning...
So if you have several beings with FMS, their comparable interests should matter equally.
Okay, so no playing favorites.
Right. Especially when it comes to distributing resources or benefits. Fairness comes into play.
I get it. So full moral status really encompasses these three things: a strong presumption against interference, a strong reason to aid, and a strong reason to treat fairly.
Yes, that's a good summary.
Now, it's important to be clear about what these reasons that come with moral status are and what they're not.
Absolutely. They're impartial, for one thing. They don't depend on any special relationship you might have with that being.
So it's not just because they're your friend or family member.
Right. It's because of their inherent moral status. And it's not about any contracts or promises either.
I see. And it's also not about the long-term consequences of your actions.
Exactly. These reasons exist purely for the sake of that being.
Okay, that's important to keep in mind. So what are some common mistakes people might make when thinking about moral status? Well, one mistake is thinking that just because an action seems especially wrong, it automatically means the being involved has a higher moral status.
Okay, so the intensity of our feeling doesn't necessarily reflect the level of moral status.
Right. It could be due to other factors, like killing your own child might seem worse than killing a stranger's child, but that doesn't necessarily mean your child has a higher moral status.
Right. The relationship adds a whole other layer.
Exactly. And the same goes for the strength of the reasons you might have to act in a certain way.
So just because there are stronger reasons to save one person over another, it doesn't mean they have different moral statuses.
It might just be because the potential loss to one is greater. Like maybe one person has a richer future ahead of them.
Right, I see. And you mentioned this idea of treating someone as if they have full moral status, even if they might not.
Yes, that's another interesting point.
Why would we do that? Well, there are a few arguments for it. One is purely practical. If we don't treat all humans as if they have FMS, it could be a slippery slope to mistreating those who do.
So it's like a safeguard.
Exactly. A way to draw a clear line.
Yeah.
And Kant, he argued against cruelty to animals, not necessarily because he thought animals had FMS,
Right.
but because being cruel to animals could make you more likely to be cruel to humans.
So it's about protecting humans, ultimately.
In a way, yes. And then there are some self-interested reasons, too.
Self-interested.
Like treating infants well, even if they don't fully meet the criteria for FMS, might lead them to treat us well when they're older.
Okay, so it's about looking out for ourselves in the long run.
Right. Or, treating all cognitively impaired people as if they have FMS protects us if we ever become cognitively impaired ourselves.
I see. But the key point is treating someone as if they have FMS isn't the same as them actually having it.
Exactly. The reasons are different.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Moral status, full moral status, the reasons that go along with it.
We have.
Now, let's talk about this idea that moral status can come in degrees.
Yes, that's a key concept.
So how do philosophers actually picture those degrees?
Well, one way is to vary the strength of those moral reasons we talked about. Like the reason not to kill a human might be much stronger than the reason not to kill a dog, which is stronger than the reason not to kill a fish, and so on.
So it's like a sliding scale of how seriously we have to take those reasons.
Exactly. And the reasons to aid or treat fairly could also vary in strength.
Okay, that makes sense. What other ways are there?
Another is to vary which reasons apply at each level. Maybe some beings only get the presumption against interference, but not the reasons to aid or be treated fairly.
Okay, so the lower down you go, the fewer reasons apply.
Right. Or maybe they only have protection against certain types of harm, but not others.
I see. So lots of possibilities there.
Yeah. And you could even combine these approaches, like maybe the highest level gets strong reasons across the board, while lower levels get weaker reasons for only some things.
Interesting. But even at the very lowest level, there's still some moral status, right?
Right. You can't just do whatever you want to something with even a tiny bit of moral status. There has to be some justification.
Okay, so it's not like a light switch. There are shades of gray.
Exactly.
Now, let's dive into these two ideas. Scalar and threshold conceptions of moral status.
Okay.
So the threshold idea is that if you have a certain capacity, You hit the threshold for a certain status, and it doesn't matter how much or how why you can use that capacity.
Right. So if valuing something is the key to a high moral status, it doesn't matter if you value one thing or a million things.
You're over the threshold either way.
Exactly. And full moral status is often seen as a threshold concept.
Yeah.
Either you have it or you don't.
Okay, that's pretty clear cut. And what about the scalar view?
Well, the scalar view is all about how much or how well you exhibit that capacity.
So the more or the better, the higher your status.
Right. And it might also consider how many morally relevant features you have.
Okay, so it's about the degree and the number.
Exactly.
But both of these ideas have some problems, right?
Yeah, they do. The threshold view can seem arbitrary. Like, why does a tiny bit of a capacity suddenly grant you full status?
And why doesn't it matter how much you actually use that capacity?
Right. And the scalar view can have some counterintuitive implications. Like, if intelligence is the key, does that mean smarter people have more of a right to life?
That doesn't sit right. Yeah, it can lead to some uncomfortable conclusions.
So both views have their issues.
They do.
Okay, let's move on to the actual grounds for moral status. What are the things that philosophers have proposed actually give something moral standing?
Well, one big one is sophisticated cognitive capacities.
Like what?
Things like the ability to reason, to be self-aware, to have future-oriented desires.
Okay, complex thinking and feeling.
Right. Kant, he was all about autonomy, the ability to set your own goals rationally.
Right, and others have focused on things like the capacity to value things intrinsically or to care for others.
But the problem with this is it leaves out a lot of humans, right?
Yeah, like infants or people with severe cognitive impairments.
They might not have those capacities.
Exactly.
So what's the solution there?
Well, some philosophers have proposed that it's not about having those capacities right now, but about the potential to develop them.
So, like, infants have the potential to become rational, self-aware adults.
Right. And this potentiality argument, as it's called, is often used to justify the moral status of fetuses, too.
Okay, so potential matters, but what are the issues with that view?
Well, one problem is that mere potential might not be enough. Just because you could become something doesn't mean you have all the rights of that thing right now.
Right, like a potential Olympic athlete doesn't get treated like an Olympic champion before they win anything.
Exactly. And what about people who will never develop those capacities no matter what?
Like people with certain disabilities.
Right. Potentiality doesn't help us there.
So it's not a perfect solution either. Are there other options?
Well, another approach is to lower the bar a bit.
Meaning?
Instead of looking at really complex capacities, maybe it's just about having basic awareness, being able to feel pleasure and pain, having simple interests.
Okay, so a more basic level of consciousness.
Right, and this would definitely include more humans, including those with cognitive impairments.
But what's the catch?
The problem is, it includes a lot of animals, too.
Ah, so now we're getting into animal rights territory.
Exactly. If sentience is enough for moral status, then a lot of animals would have the same status as humans.
And that goes against a lot of people's intuitions.
It does. And even those who argue for equal consideration of interests, like many utilitarians do.
Right, treating equal amounts of suffering equally.
Even they have trouble explaining why we seem to view humans with severe cognitive impairments as having a higher status than, say, a dog with similar capacities.
So it's a tricky issue.
It is.
Okay, so we've looked at sophisticated cognitive capacities, potential for those capacities, basic consciousness. What else is there?
Well, another idea is that moral status is tied to being human, period.
Simply being a member of the human species.
Yes, that would certainly include all humans, regardless of their abilities.
Okay, but that seems kind of arbitrary, doesn't it?
It can, yeah. Why should species membership alone matter? What if we met aliens who were just as smart as us or even smarter? Would we say they don't have moral status just because they're not human?
Right, that doesn't seem right.
It doesn't. And there are thought experiments with super intelligent chimps that highlight this problem too.
Okay, so species membership is a bit of a dead end. What other avenues have philosophers explored?
Well, some have focused on the importance of relationships.
Relationships.
Yeah, like maybe being part of the same species creates a special bond that gives you moral obligations to others of that species.
So I have a stronger duty to other humans because we're all human?
That's the idea. Or maybe it's about specific relationships, like being someone's child.
Okay, so the relationship itself generates moral duties.
Right. But the problem with this is, it often creates reasons for specific people only. Like, maybe I have a duty to my child, but does a stranger have that same duty?
And what about that Martian we talked about? Would they have no reason to care about human infants?
Right. It doesn't seem to capture the universality of moral status.
It's too limited.
Exactly. And some versions of this can be over-inclusive or under-inclusive, depending on how you define the relationship.
Right, like if it's about social bonds, do dolphins suddenly get the same status as humans?
Yeah, that's a problem.
So relationship-based views have their issues too. Are there any other approaches out there? Anything a bit more out of the box?
Well, one relatively recent idea focuses on incompletely realized, sophisticated cognitive capacities. A mouthful, I know.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the idea is, if having complex thoughts and feelings gives you moral status,
Mm-hmm.
then having the capacity to sort of partially do those things should matter too.
Partially.
Yeah, like think of a young child learning to play an instrument. They're not Mozart yet, but they're on their way.
Okay, I see.
And maybe some of the things that infants or people with cognitive impairments do can be seen as incomplete versions of more complex activities,
Yeah.
especially if they're being guided by someone.
So it's about the potential for development plus the guidance they're getting.
Right. And this could potentially explain why we view human infants differently than, say, baby animals, even if their current abilities are similar.
Interesting. But does this automatically grant them full moral status?
Not necessarily. It might give them a higher status than they'd have otherwise, but it might not be the full package.
Okay, so it's more about explaining the difference between humans and animals than about granting full moral status.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It seems like we've covered a lot of ground here, and every approach to grounding moral status has its own set of problems.
It's a tough nut to crack.
It really is. And there are even more unconventional ideas out there, like basing moral status on whether something's natural or artificial, or on its role in the ecosystem.
Right, but those raise a whole other set of questions.
They do. And even beyond finding the right grounds for moral status, there's the deeper question of why any of these things should matter morally in the first place.
Absolutely, that's a fundamental philosophical issue.
And philosophers have offered different justifications. Some focus on the value of autonomy, others on the ability to experience a good life, others on hypothetical agreements, and still others on minimizing suffering.
Right. Each justification tries to explain why a certain capacity or characteristic makes something worthy of moral consideration.
So, for you, our listener, who's been with us on this deep dive into moral status, I think the main takeaway is this. It's a really complex issue.
It is.
What seems like a simple question, who matters morally, turns out to be incredibly hard to answer in a way that's philosophically sound and matches our intuitions.
And maybe that tells us something important about moral reasoning itself. Like maybe the journey of grappling with these questions, exploring all the different arguments and challenges, is just as important as finding a definitive answer.
That's a good point.
So, keep thinking about your own views on moral status. How do these different theories apply to the real world? What are the implications for animal welfare, for disability rights, for the environment?
Yeah, there's a lot to ponder here. And if any of this has sparked your interest, we encourage you to dive deeper into those specific areas. There's a whole world of philosophical thought out there waiting to be explored.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.